We have an interesting guest tonight. Hopefully some of you have done a little bit of checking. Sean came to me from a friend at the IANS organization, said that Sean would be a good person to make a presentation. So I reached out to Sean, and he graciously responded, said he'd be willing to do this. Here's one of his books that I purchased and read, just finished it the past few days, called The Renegade Mystic. And we're going to talk a little bit about this tonight. Sean has an interesting story, and I'm going to let him talk about it, but at some point I'm going to come in and draw some parallels to some things or make some comments. After the presentation is over, as we always do, we open it up for questions, and there are two ways that you'll be able to do that. You can, if you don't want to personally do it, you can type something in the chat room, and I will read it, or you can raise your hand and have a chance to interact with Sean personally. So, Sean, you kind of got started. I think I'd be curious. You spend the first half of your book talking about your Buddhist efforts, and I'd like to get a sense for what took you down that path. It's how did you happen to get interested in that to begin with? And let's use that as a jumping off point for you to get into a presentation.
Yeah, that sounds great. And first of all, thank you for having me on Consciousness Cafe. I really appreciate the chance to share my story with others. Yeah, so getting to why I became a Buddhist, first of all, because I was raised in a Roman Catholic family. When I was about 7 years old, I had appendicitis, and I didn't know what it was when it happened to me. So I was in a lot of pain for a couple of days, and then went in to the hospital and had surgery. And after the surgery, they told me that my appendix had ruptured, and if I'd gotten there much later, it could have been infected and I could have died. And that's the first time in my life I thought about the idea of death in a personal way. Like, oh, I could have died. And it hurt a lot. I was in a lot of pain for a couple of days. So the idea of pain and then death were joined in my mind at that early age. And growing up from there, I got more interested in religion, including the Catholic faith, because that was a direct source of information, so to speak, from a religion. That little things would happen that would make me doubt more and more what I was being told to believe. And I think it's just in my personality to be skeptical, to be stubborn, to want to figure things out for myself instead of just being given the answers or told what to believe. And when I was at that age, and actually through most of my childhood growing up, my dad worked for an insurance company that transferred us to different countries. So when I had my appendectomy, that was in the Philippines. And then after that, we lived in Hong Kong for a couple of years. And all those years, we would travel to other countries in Asia. And that's how I was exposed to Buddhism and other religions, like folk religions, and just realizing that Catholicism and Christianity are not the only religions in the world, that the world is a big place. And there are other ways of viewing life and reality and consciousness and what happens after you die. And I started really seeking answers to that question, what happens after we die? Because I was scared, knowing that I would die and not willing to believe, well, good dogs go to heaven and bad dogs go somewhere else. I wasn't satisfied. And even though I was exposed to Buddhism as a kid, it wasn't really until I moved here to Denver. I moved here as a senior in high school, went to college here, and after college, I discovered that there was Buddhist groups in Denver. And I think it was being independent from my family that gave me the inner strength to start exploring other paths. And I found a local Buddhist meditation center, and I started training with them. And it was one of those traditions. I don't want to say who it is specifically because I keep it anonymous in the book. But it's one of those traditions, at least the American version, where if you want the next secret, if you want the next highest teaching, you have to go on an expensive retreat. You have to spend thousands of dollars. You have to be good enough. You have to, climb the ladder, so to speak. And I bought into it. And I followed that path for a number of years and climbing that ladder and going on all the retreats, thinking I was actually developing myself. And one thing I didn't realize at the time was that by doing that, I thought I had a path there. And I was interested in using meditation to answer my own questions. But one thing I didn't notice was that I had stopped seeking my own answers. And instead, I was trying to be a good Buddhist according to this specific tradition. I was, like any religion, they have it laid out pretty clearly. Here's what you do, here's what you don't do. Here are signs along the way to show you that you're developing. Here's how you should relate to your teachers. And I was doing a really good job of following that formula. And it led me to believe I was actually getting somewhere. And then something happened to break me out of that, to wake me up. And it was that I attended a retreat that was supposed to be this very advanced retreat where you get blessings and you get empowered to do these secret practices. And to another state with a girlfriend at the time. And late at night, one night during that retreat, one of the teachers, and this is a Tibetan guru type situation, one of his attendants came to our door where we were staying and invited her to go see the teacher. And we had heard rumors, which we didn't want to believe, but we had heard rumors that he would do this once in a while. And he would sleep with some of his female students. But we really hoped that it wasn't true. And then here it was. He invited her. And we had talked about it at the start of the retreat. I said, you wouldn't do that if he invited you, would you? Theoretically. And she's like, oh, of course not. That's gross. He's my teacher. But when the invitation came at the door, and we had just been arguing that whole day, our relationship was on the rocks already. But the first thing she did was put on some fresh clothes, and she was excited. Before I could really say much, she was out the door, more than willing to go be with him. And she was for the whole night. She didn't come back till the next morning. And I just had one of the worst nights of my life. And still, I didn't wake up all the way, but it started causing doubts in my head. Like, this guy isn't really a model for what I'm looking for in a teacher. And what is he getting out of this? And, I started to notice the amount of power he had, the amount of money he was making. I started to look at this tradition as more of a business, and the whole climbing the ladder thing, and seeing how it's a pretty savvy business structure. It's like a pyramid scheme in a sense. And I started getting really turned off by the whole thing. And the really tricky part is, in this tradition, the relationship to the guru is so important, or that's how it's taught to be, that your blessings that allow you to become enlightened come from your relationship with the teacher. And because of that, and this is related to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the Vajrayana tradition, as long as you see your teacher as being basically perfect, like a Buddha, then whatever the teacher does, their actions are seen as pure. And if they happen to hurt you, it's for your benefit. That's the view that you're taught. So they kind of, whatever they do is fine. You're the one with the problem if you have a problem with how they're behaving. And I started to just wake up from that. You know what? I don't think that's really true. At least in this case, I don't think this guy's enlightened at all. He might believe he is, but I don't know. And I started to realize all the rumors were true, and a lot of people had quietly left. And the whole thing, I just started to realize also that I hadn't grown. But I still somehow I didn't realize I should just leave completely. And I went looking for another teacher. And I found one.
Right.
And he ended up being a narcissist and being psychologically abusive. So he also had issues with power. And there was a lot of money involved with it too, because when their only source of income is giving spiritual or religious teachings, they need to, keep the students they have and do things to get more students and keep selling them more and more programs and retreats. And you're never finished because you have to pay more money. but the psychological abuse that came from him was almost as bad as what the other teacher had done. The other teacher hadn't abused me, but I think he had taken advantage of my girlfriend, using his power to basically have sex with her. But with this teacher, it was psychological, and it was about money. And I was getting close to leaving. But one thing I did that gave me the courage to leave was I remembered when I was a teenager, I'd come across that Robert Monroe book, Journeys Out of the Body. And I checked it out because of my fear of death. I thought, maybe if I can learn how to have an out-of-body experience, I will, see that some part of me is not physical or is beyond physical, and that part of me might continue after I die. And if I could only have an out-of-body experience, that would relieve me of my ongoing fear that I've carried with me all these years. Now, as a teenager, I wasn't at all able to have an out-of-body experience with his book. I think it's a beautiful book, but the instructions on how to have an OBE aren't great in it. And even the author says that it's kind of tricky to describe it in his book. And the reason I found his book is because I watched that series on TV from the 80s by Out on a Limb by Shirley MacLaine. I don't know if any of you saw that back then, but there's a scene where she's in Peru and she's in a hot tub and she goes out of her body spontaneously. And I was just entranced by that. And I said, I got to do that. And that'll make me stop being afraid of dying. But as a kid, as a teenager, I wasn't able to have an OBE. But now I was so frustrated with my Buddhist teachers that I thought, why did I let go of my own pursuit, finding my own answer to the question of death? Instead, I'm just doing a good job following these guys' teachings, but that's not really getting me anywhere. And I'm not really becoming more evolved spiritually, I don't think. So I found new authors. There's an author named William Buhlman, especially. I loved his books and I followed them and I trained myself for several months. And then I had my first out-of-body experience. And it was a partial separation. But still, when it ended and when I returned to my body, instantly, my fear of death was gone. And that's when I got the courage to have a face-to-face meeting with a teacher, tell him what I thought about what he was doing to his students, and say, I'm done. I'm done with this. And I found my own way. And goodbye. And so I left him and I left a whole group. And I mean, it hurt too, because most of these people were my friends, or I should say most of my friends I'd gained through these spiritual groups. And I had to say goodbye to them too, because you can't stay in the group if you leave the teacher. And I realized this weird dynamic too, of when you leave the group, people who stay in the group, they sort of see you as a threat, like you're questioning their situation. So either they treat you as a possible threat to their beliefs, or they try and get you back with love bombing and trying to convince you to come back. And something's wrong with me because I'm judging the teacher too harshly. But I was satisfied by leaving, because then I realized that in this situation too, so many people had quietly left. And I kind of made a little bit of noise when I left, but many people had left quietly. And I realized that was it, that they saw there was a problem with the teacher and they just needed to stop. And they figured it out on their own. For me, it took an out-of-body experience to get the courage, because without it, I would have probably still looked to someone else to tell me what happens when we die, or to tell me that some part of us really is non-physical, that we have non-physical consciousness or something like that. Or if I do this Buddhist thing enough that I'll become enlightened and then it won't be a problem anymore. So fortunately, I succeeded at having out-of-body experiences, which gave me the courage to say goodbye to all those people I held above me, like people I had turned my personal power to. I was able to walk away and reclaim my power, but then I had to kind of learn, who am I? Because I'd let go of my identity. I was a teacher in this organization. I was leading retreats. I was guiding people. And I had kind of developed an ego around it, an identity around it. So I had to leave that identity behind to figure out who I was. I continued teaching just because of the love of it, but not in that role, or not with that status, not with that organization or that label. just teaching out of the love of it. So that was the major gift of having out-of-body experiences for me. And I don't know if this is a good time to pause, Jim, or should I keep going?
Well, I want a couple questions I want to pose to you.
Yeah.
As you talked about this Buddhist experience, it seemed to me, I've studied Christianity and the origins of Christianity. Back after about just before the Nicene Council, where it was decided what are going to be the books in the Bible, there were a lot of different thoughts about what Jesus was about. And what came to the forefront, what became known as Orthodox Christianity, became the Roman Catholic Church, was very focused on a hierarchical. We needed the right form of Christianity is the one that can trace back to Jesus, and that you need to have people interceding on your behalf. You can't have a direct relationship with God. You have to rely on priests, and that kind of, it seemed to me that there was an interesting parallel there to what you were experiencing, that you're supposed to look up to somebody else, and you aren't worthy of achieving their level. So I see that. I look at while you were talking, and I don't mean to sound overly negative, but I think about Scientology. It seems like we have a lot of people who are looking for answers and may be susceptible to people who come across as having those answers. We see that in our politics, I think, as well. And so messages like yours I think are important, that we can explore on our own. We can have our own relationships, our own experiences. We don't have to be dependent upon others to tell us what to believe and how to live our spiritual lives. So why don't you continue on?
Yeah. Well, it's such an important point. I just want to add to it a little bit, that when someone has a personal question, let's say a spiritual question, and they don't have the answer yet, that is a very, very vulnerable place for them to be in. And I don't mean vulnerable as an insult or like it's something bad. They're vulnerable because their heart is open, their eyes are open, they're looking, and there are people out there ready to give them information in exchange for power, money, whatever else. So there are people waiting to tell you the answer to your question, and it might not be the right answer. It might not be helpful for you. It might be helpful for them to form a connection. So it's such a vulnerable state before a person has figured out how to find their own answer. And I think it's just a human thing, because we grow up as infants and toddlers and children, and we look to our parents to take care of us. And I think something like that continues as we grow up into adulthood and even late adulthood. We are like children looking for our parents to tell us what's going on in this reality. And so there's that vulnerability there, which, again, it's not a bad thing, but I think it's just how humans are. And for someone to know that they're vulnerable, I think is important, because then they'll be careful with who they give their power to, or they'll be careful by taking information into consider without turning their personal power to someone. So there are different ways of learning, but too often people will just give everything they have to whoever's willing to give them the answer that seems right, even though it might not be right. So after I spent a long period of time training myself with out-of-body experiences, I was continuing to teach meditation, but I really wanted to teach people that specific notion that we are more than physical beings, and that we are interconnected with our reality, which is something that I think all, if not many, or many, if not all, religions and spiritual paths teach that we are interconnected. And even physics now can show that, that we are connected on a very subtle level. And I started seeing people online doing telekinesis. It's a form of psychokinesis, mind over matter. I use the word telekinesis to indicate distance, so moving an object from a distance. And I saw people doing this. The first one who I saw doing this that really, really inspired me was a woman named Cheryl Lee Black. And it was a recording of a presentation she gave at an IONS conference, because she was a near-death experience. I think she had 3 near-death experiences. And she had incredible powers to affect material objects around her, especially when her mood was off a little bit. And it had begun when she was a child, actually. She tells a story about getting angry at a teacher, and then a book just flew across the room and struck the teacher. So, and the refrigerator crawling across the floor without anyone pushing it. So, very powerful person there. But that's what really made me think this stuff is legitimate. And then over several months, using principles of meditation that I was aware of, I taught myself how to do this with very, very small objects. So all the videos you would find on me online or on my website, I have a telekinesis page, and some of my favorite videos are there. It's little objects balanced on a needle, like a little piece of paper, a tin foil, and then with a glass dome over it. And sometimes I'm up close, and sometimes I'm across the room, and I have a video where I'm in the garage 10 stories down, and there are cameras everywhere, setting my intention to it. That's, there we go, right there. Some people call
I don't
that
know if people can see this. Sean mentioned Cheryl Lee Black. She came to the Rhine Center and did a seminar one day on her abilities. What I have in front of me is the cap to an empty peanut butter jar. Inside the cap is an eraser with a needle on it, and on top of that needle is a folded piece of aluminum foil. And then you put the top of the peanut butter jar back on it to seal it. And now you try to make an effort to get that little piece of tinfoil to move.
Mm-hmm.
And Sean, you've had success with this.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I worked on it for a while. It was several months, sitting in front of my object with a glass cover over it, sometimes for half an hour, 40 minutes, or even over an hour, day after day after day, trying to figure out, how does this work? How do you do this? And, there's always the idea that heat is just making the air move. And because if I kept my hands on the container, sometimes it would heat up the air and it would start to move. But I realized that I could control the movement with my state of mind. And I could also make it move when I was sitting 3 feet away from the object. And I developed this system, and it's basically similar to, if any of you have done meditation on specific points in the body or worked with energy centers or chakras, you're basically putting your attention somewhere in the body for an extended period of time. And I said to myself, why don't I just treat that little piece of tinfoil or paper as if it were a chakra, and do my own breathing process, my breathing to relax the mind and the body, to help the energy flow, and share some of the energy with the object. That was the basic principle I was working with. But still, it really wouldn't move to my satisfaction. And then one night, I was going to bed. I lay my head down on my pillow, and the spontaneous image of the piece of tinfoil moving appeared in my mind's eye, like right here behind my forehead. Whether my eyes were open or closed, I could not stop. This image was just in my head right here of the tinfoil moving. I said, what is that about? And eventually I drifted off to sleep. But the next day or 2 days later, I can't remember now, I sat down, did my breathing technique that I thought might be helpful, and the object started to move. And I was so happy. And I realized what it was some part of me deep down inside didn't believe it was possible. Some part of my subconscious was like, this is BS, or this is off limits, or don't do it for whatever reason. Maybe there was fear, I don't know. But once that little window in my mind opened up and this image of it moving started happening, I realized something had changed inside of me. And maybe all those weeks and months of sitting in front of it, working at it, and nothing happening, something was happening. And I was convincing myself that I really did want this to happen. I did want to do it, and it was possible. And it started moving. Ironically, soon after I succeeded, I asked my wife if she wanted to try it. And she said, sure. And she sat down in front of it. And I started to tell her how to do it. And she's like, shut up. I can do it. And she just sat down and she just did this with her hands, something like this. Not close to it, but a couple of feet away, just doing this. And it started moving for her. And I was frustrated because I had to work so hard for it. But on her first try, she could do it. But I realized something important about the subconscious belief, because I knew from talking to her that most or much of her life, she would have dreams or lucid dreams in which she would move objects in the dream state. So indicating that her subconscious mind was already accepting of this possibility. And she just jumped in, and she wasn't concerned with the results. Meanwhile, I'm very concerned about the results. I wanted to succeed so that I could teach this to other people, because I couldn't lay down on the floor and show people what an out-of-body experience is like to show them that we are non-physical beings. No, I could teach people the techniques to have their own experiences, but you can't really show someone an out-of-body experience. They have to have it for themselves. But I could, if I got good enough at it, show people telekinesis in broad daylight with their own eyes. They would be able to see me connecting with this object and watch it move in response to my intention, and also to the way I breathed and changed the energy in my body. Just briefly, if you inhale a certain way and it's turning, you can hold your breath and set an intention, and you can make it stop. And you can then exhale, release your intention, and then either it'll reverse direction or start speeding up more again. So there's this connection between breath, subtle energy, and then how that energy connects with everything else. So I that was a big thing for me, because I did it on my own. I didn't need a guru, a teacher. I didn't need to turn my energy or my personal power to someone else. I just used what I already knew and worked at it really hard for a long period of time, and succeeded at this thing that still most people think is impossible and not true. I think still most people think telekinesis is a magical illusion or something, but it's not. Although magicians can do it as a magic trick, but that's not the real thing. So I figured it out, which really added to my self-empowerment and really confirmed that, yes, I can still learn more and more deeper truths about reality on my own if I just work at it. And then I worked on other things. I took a year-long course in mediumship, and I got certified at the end, but I don't do it. It's just not my thing. And I don't think I'm good enough to really help people. But during that process, we learned about remote viewing and clairvoyance. And then I started just teaching a very organic, basic level of remote viewing with friends. And over the next couple of years, we worked on it, and I developed a small group of friends, and we actually used it as a team to predict the pick 3 lottery. You just have to find the 3 correct numbers. And 2 years ago, we won twice using this method. And I think it's always important for me to mention that, because I'm trying to tell people this stuff is real. Because the process of using a remote viewing to predict a lottery involves not only clairvoyance, but precognition. You have to perceive a photo you'll be shown the following day after the lottery numbers are drawn. There's more to it than that, but it's pretty complicated without a PowerPoint presentation. But we produced a lot of evidence through our drawings and our targets and everything that people can perceive across space and time, which I think is connected to telekinesis, because not only are you perceiving, with your eyes, but you're connecting with the object across space without touching it physically. And then the out-of-body experience, you're extending yourself from the physical body to another space, either in this realm here while we're awake, or to other levels of reality. And so for me, it all comes down to information, consciousness, and what consciousness experiences is all information, knowing itself on some deep level. That's just how I think of it. um, yeah, so I just did that. And, at the end of it, the conclusion I came to actually, and I don't like to say this to people who are just starting to learn this stuff, but I don't know if any of you are, especially with the out of body experience training, a lot of the techniques I used involved me getting out of bed in the middle of the night and moving to my training area, which was a couch in the living room. And sometimes I'd use a massage table set up in the living room, but a different space. And I'd had quite a few out of body experiences. But at a certain point, I realized that, for me anyway, my understanding was the highest level of spiritual learning comes from the limitations we have with our physical bodies and the struggles we encounter in life. And by me trying to spend all my time out of my body, I was sort of leaving the classroom of life in a way. It's funny because I went through a period of, after having a certain number of out of body experiences, where I would even get frustrated walking across a parking lot, like if I would go to the grocery store, because I knew that in the out of body state, in the blink of an eye, I could be across the parking lot. So I was sort of not losing touch, but I was changing my expectations for this life. Well, why do I have to walk in this physical body? But I realized it's because it is through our limitations and the passage of time that gives us the opportunity to learn and to experience at a pace where our consciousness can develop. And so that's just how I think of it. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but it's just a filter that I use to contemplate my own experiences. But the other thing I realized was all those nights when I leave bed, I'm leaving my wife in a sense for the night. And we hadn't been together very long, but it was around the time we got married. And so I realized the preciousness of time, and that as part of that lesson of life, that I needed to just be in my body. And I'd rather spend the next many nights of my life holding my wife in the physical form, rather than being in another room training to have an out of body experience. If we are non-physical beings that continue after death, I'll have plenty of time to float around. But right now I'm in this body, she's in her body, and we won't have these bodies very long. So this is my time to live with her and experience things with her. And that's really when I stopped voluntarily having out of body experiences and training for them. I stopped the training. I'm like, I got what I needed from the experience. I don't have anything to prove by doing more and more and more. I can still teach people how to do them if they want to, but I don't need to do it for myself. And I had to go through the same process with the telekinesis, because I think there's a natural limit of how much I could actually move, how big a physical object. There's a natural limit there. So what else? How much did I have to move, or how big an object, to prove to myself that it was enough, or to prove it to other people? And with the telekinesis, actually, I had to stop also because I was starting to develop a heartache, and I had had heart surgery earlier in life. So I was very sensitive to how my heart felt. And I remembered, some of you may have seen these videos of Nina Kulagina, the Russian mystic. It's kind of her public name. She has another, a birth name is different, but we all know her as Nina Kulagina. These black and white videos of her moving salt and pepper shakers across the table, or a row of toothpicks and matchsticks across the table. And they say that she could move things close to a pound in weight through her abilities. But she would train for 2 to 4 hours at a time. Her heart rate would go through the ceiling. They would weigh her before and after her sessions, and she would have lost pounds of body weight after an entire day of doing her telekinesis. And she eventually died of a heart attack. And I also know of a young man from Turkey named Fadi Mir, who he had some videos on Facebook and YouTube, and he could do some pretty incredible things too. And he's a young man, I think in his late 20s or early 30s. And I found out that he died, and I think it was a simultaneous aneurysm and a heart attack. Like something popped and he died. And I realized, because my heart was aching in the last stages of my training, because I was pushing harder and harder to move bigger things. And I think if any of you have seen the Heart Math videos or know the Heart Math program, And even outside of heart math, there's a scientific understanding that the heart produces its own electromagnetic field. The brain has its own electromagnetic field, but the heart field is much larger than the brain. And then our whole body has its own field. And so, using the hypothesis that my heart's electromagnetic field was involved with producing the telekinetic effect, I thought, okay, I'm stretching it here. I'm really testing the limits of my heart's health. And is it worth it? Is it worth a heart attack just to move something slightly bigger? If that's what's happening, it's not worth it to me. And that's when I stopped that. And I tell people that too privately. People email me all the time with questions about their training. And a common thing is they want to do bigger and bigger things. And I think part of it is because of Hollywood. We've seen things in the movies of people moving objects with their mind, or superheroes doing tremendous things. But that's not the real thing. The real thing is a very subtle, gentle effect. Unless you're Shirley Black, and then these poltergeist type things happen. And that's a whole other order of things. So, but in terms of teaching yourself slowly over time to move very small objects, I think there are a lot of deep lessons there. And then there's the whole character lesson of, well, what am I trying to prove? Or does this change who I am? And in what way does it make me a better person? And honestly, over the last couple of years, I've had more and more instances of people who've emailed me or contacted me on Facebook or whatever, and they I hate to say this, but I'm going to be honest, that they exhibit narcissistic tendencies, or they're very aggressive, they're very judgmental. If I don't answer their questions the way they like, they get very nasty. And I had hoped so much. I had hoped that the whole out-of-body experience thing and the telekinesis thing, because it's a very meditative technique, that it could be its own type of spiritual growth, and it would help people develop their positive qualities of patience, understanding, interconnectedness, compassion, gentleness. I thought these qualities could increase as people trained with it. But I realize now that is not the case. A person can be very aggressive and have personality disorders or behavioral issues and still produce psychic effects. Like, it doesn't necessarily make you a better person. And I hope that wasn't the case, but I'm pretty convinced now that any kind of person can learn how to do these, and they don't have to be concerned with being a better person, to use a value judgment there. But yeah, I think I should pause here.
There are a lot of programs that people can participate in. I've wrestled with, why do I have an interest in all these things? Is it because I have an ego that wants to say, look what I've done? I've gotten to a point where it doesn't, that's not why I do the things I do. I'm old enough that maybe I've matured enough to say, this is something of value for me personally. And it's my role is to help other people find value in their own experiences, whatever they are. It's not to tell people, boy, you got to go out and have an out-of-body experience. I've known people who didn't realize they had empathic abilities, and they thought there was something wrong with them. When they meet other people who understand what their own skill sets are, then they start seeing themselves in a different light. Well, so there's nothing wrong with me then. I have some psychic capacity, and if we could get more acceptance of these things, I think in society, maybe there'd be a lot more comfort and growth, spiritual growth that would go on. But you ever seen an Egley wheel?
Yeah, I worked with one. I have some videos on my website actually of me and my wife together working with an Egley wheel. And it's really interesting because the one there with me and my wife has this section where the Egley wheel is in front of me and my hand is nearby, and I'm working with it, getting it to move a little bit. And then my wife And we've both been in past lives. We were actually, and decades ago, we were massage therapists. So we're very touchy-feely and sensitive to energy that way. And in these videos, you can see that she's got her hand in front of my heart at a certain point, and she's sending me energy, and the Eggly wheel starts responding, starts turning faster. And then she lowers her hand down over my solar plexus. And then the Eggly wheel really starts spinning, and it makes a little beeping sound so you can hear the increase in speed. It was really interesting because when we made those videos, we had gotten away for the weekend to the mountains in Colorado because I was at a really low point energetically in my life, and I could barely do anything, any of these psychic things. I was worn out, probably from my own ego. So I was at the bottom of the barrel. So working with the Eggly wheel was frustrating in the beginning, and I realized what was going on because when my wife helped me by sending energy into me, then the energy flowed through me and the Eggly wheel started turning faster. And I realized I am running on empty, and I'm probably at risk of making myself sick on some level if I continue this way. So it was a wake-up call, and I took a break, which still has kind of lasted until this time. I mean, I've done some other things, but I do a lot less now than I ever used to because of that realization that I could just spill out my energy and all my effort to do these things. But for what? When I probably need that energy for my general health and a positive state of mind. And also realizing that psychic abilities don't really help with a deeper level of spiritual growth. I still want to develop myself in certain ways, and I use meditation as part of that. And I realized that having experienced those psychic phenomena, I learned from them, and it was helpful, but I don't need them. And someone could have a perfectly great spiritual path without any psychic abilities whatsoever, and they'll be fine. They'll answer their own questions the way they need to. The psychic stuff is sort of just extra. I think it can be useful. It was useful for me, but it's not necessary for growth. But I think also from a human perspective, it's super. They're super cool. They're very interesting. But after a certain point, they've served their purpose.
Yeah. There was something that occurred to me when I read your book. Do you know who Ken Ring is?
Oh, I've heard that name, but I can't. Isn't he a filmmaker or?
No, he's one of the foremost NDE researchers.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
And he wrote a book that I read a long time ago that had an impact on me. It's called Lessons from the Light. And he talked about, part of what he talked about is what near-death experiences go through when they have a life review. If people aren't familiar with that, quite often somebody who has a near-death experience gets a full review of everything that transpired in their lives, and sometimes experience it not just from their vantage point, but from the vantage point of people they interacted with. And it seemed to me that resonated with me. Ken Ring talks about a benign virus, that if you read enough near-death experiences, you will get some benefit from it as if you'd had a near-death experience. It'll positively impact your life. And I'd have to say, with all the reading I've done on near-death experiences, that's been the case for me. There are a lot of different ways that you can go about pursuing spiritual growth. And I just say that might be another one. Study other people's experiences and value them. And you may find that you internalize some of these things yourself. Fear of death. I don't think I have a fear of death anymore. Is it just because I've gotten older? Is it because of all the reading I've done? I think once you become aware that this life we're living is a subset of something more, then you can start putting more value on what's awaiting you and not put it all on just what you have to experience in one lifetime. We had a comment in the chat room. I'd like to bring that up. Carolyn said that back when you were talking about out-of-body experiences, you can have multidimensional experiences simultaneously, not necessary to leave your body. It's possible to have multiple awarenesses. Observing the human experience without attachment allows deeper awareness of other dimensional experiences. Carolyn, I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that. It's a very interesting comment. I might pose a question to you, if you're there. Well,
no. Well, I agree with her, because when someone is doing a mediumship reading, they're, depending on what's actually happening, through their mind and the consciousness, they're communicating with someone who's not here in the physical space, but they're here from that other space. At the same time, while the medium is wide awake in this physical room, but some part of their mind is connecting. Maybe they're linked up with, a being who's linking them to the person who's deceased, or direct connection, but they're tuning in at the same time. Someone who's performing remote viewing or using clairvoyance, they're wide awake, yet still they're perceiving things happening somewhere else in time and space. Same thing with precognition. And I've heard of people having out-of-body experiences spontaneously while running a marathon, while giving birth in the hospital, during traumatic events. Some part of them is wide awake and doing the things we all do while we're awake, but that deeper part of them at the same time is experiencing life from this other reality, which is so interesting.
Carolyn has unmuted herself. Carolyn, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, it took me a minute. Sorry. Did you have a specific question to ask me?
Well, one of the concepts, Robert Monroe did a lot of out-of-body experiencing. And he would run into what he finally came to understand were other aspects of himself. So a concept, I don't know if you have any thoughts on it, but some people would say we have a higher self, and this Jim Fisher that's here now is a subset of something broader, and that maybe that's related to what you're saying, that somehow we have multiple components of our higher selves that we can tap into.
That would be one way to word it. So a little different than what Sean was saying. My experience is I do the things that he was saying. I get information that comes through me intuitively. So remote viewing, those kind of things. And I have my entire life. But it's to the point now where it's developed to, I am that. So it is not an outer body experience. It is that I am the observer of Carolyn having the human experience, and I am connected to other, there's not really words for it. It's not a realm. It's not a dimension. I'm just awareness, other awarenesses simultaneously, and they're not necessarily mine. So it's not just, it's the collective that you can get to the point where you tune into the collective, and it's not the individuation, because if you're aware that there's a connectivity amongst all of us, which is how you can do any of this, that's where you can tap into that. So it could even be the gym that I get information come through me, and usually it's for the purposes to share with that individual. So I've learned to look at it like I'm a conduit or an interpreter or a translator that shares the information with that person, kind of to help them get out of their own way to get in touch with their a broader depth of their awareness.
That's interesting. I assume this is something that you learned how to control, that you can choose when you experience this, or is it something that...
Not necessarily. Sometimes
No?
it just it wants to come visit. Yeah. I say that jokingly, like, yeah, sometimes I think I have proclaimed the willingness to be a participant on some level. So I'm sure I could tune it out, but I have been, I feel like that's one of the things that I can offer other people.
Mm-hmm. Charles, I think you've got a question you may want to pose.
Yes, I just wanted to mention, back in my college days, I had a training manual for astral projection. And after going through this manual, I had 3 distinct out-of-body experiences, none of which I could verify, but they were very vivid, very distinct, one instance, I hovered by the bookcase trying to recognize some titles so that I could jump once I was back in my body, I could jump back over to the bookcase and verify that I'd been there. And I started getting pulled back to my body. My hand went through the bookcase and I was back in my body and woke up. So my question, have you ever been able to substantiate being out of your body or attempted to be out of your body at the same time someone else was and see them?
I haven't tried to on purpose. I think the closest thing I could talk about will be deeply dissatisfying as evidence, but it's still interesting. One time I went out of body experience. I found myself spontaneously, I thought it was spontaneous, walking down the back stairwell of our apartment, going down to the laundry room. And as I'm walking down the steps, I knocked my astral hand against one of the wooden posts on the way down to the basement. And I scraped it. And I looked down and I saw that my hand was bleeding. But I was clearly aware that I was having an out-of-body experience. And I thought it was funny that I was bleeding because I was non-physical. So I just shook my hand and the blood was gone, indicating it was just a concept. It was a mental concept that I'd brought into my experience. And the experience went on. But the following night, in the regular waking state of my body, I was hanging out in the kitchen with my wife and she started to do her laundry. So she had a laundry basket full of clothes and she walked down that staircase. And when she walked down, she banged her hand against the wooden post and scraped her hand in the exact same spot that I had scraped my hand during the out-of-body experience the night before. So for me, that indicates I was using the out-of-body experience as some sort of precognitive, having her experience type of thing. And for me, there was a strange type of evidence. It doesn't really count as real evidence because you can't prove it. But that I had an OBE that very closely matched my wife's actual experience the next day, I take that as meaningful. It was telling me something about our interconnectedness, about our ability to perceive events in the future, other people's events, not just our own, and maybe because at the deepest level, we are not separate. So that's one. I've had OBEs where I get out and my wife is out. I remember when she was in the chair next to the bed, that she was curled up in her astral body, sleeping in the chair. And there are others where she was awake and I would ask her about it. And she could never remember that I was in contact with her. Of course, having OBEs, there's a memory issue too, especially if it's spontaneous. Memory is easier when you're voluntarily trying to have one because some part of your mind is more activated there. But I don't have a more satisfying evidential type of OBE that I can report. I do always like to tell people in the book, The End of Materialism by Charles Tart, he talks about a scientific experiment they did with a woman who they named Miss Z, just for her privacy. They just called her Miss Z. She was very skilled at having OBEs on command. That's the difficulty is, can you do it the night you say you're going to do it? That's really tough, but she could do it. And they put a set of numbers up near the ceiling where she wouldn't be able to see it if she was awake in the body. But they would ask her to have an out-of-body experience, fly up there and look at these numbers. I think it was a string of 6 digits. And then when she came back and came to her body to report what those numbers were, and she succeeded. And this is in a laboratory setting. She left soon after that. Dr. Tart tried to locate her, and they could never find her again to do more experiments. But it's in that book called The End of Materialism, which when I was getting into all this was really inspirational for me because it does help connect the dots between evidence and these experiences that seem to, that you can't really do great experiments with them, but some scientists have done a lot of work and research, and Charles Tart is one of them. I also like any book by Dean Radin. I mean, his latest is called Real Magic. He's a scientist with the Institute of Noetic Sciences. doing a lot of research on consciousness and its ability to affect physical matter or to perceive across space and time. So those are the people I look to for evidence, are these scientists willing to put their reputations and careers on the line to study this wacky stuff. But the data they get is pretty good.
Charles, have you ever read Thomas Campbell's book, My Big Toe, Theory of Everything?
I have not.
Thomas was a nuclear physicist who worked with Robert Monroe in the early days, exploring the use of sound technology to produce altered states of awareness. And in his book, he talks about some experiments. Once they learned how to get out of body, they would write a number on a blackboard in another room and attempt to go to see what that number was. And in his book, he says they had a lot of success. But I'd also say one of his theories is that there's an infinite number of realities out there. So when somebody has an out-of-body experience, it's not always, if you look around the room that you're in, if you're in your bedroom, there may be something different about it. For example, a different lampshade, or the wall is painted a different color. Everything else seems to be the same. But his theory is that that this reality we live in is just one of many potential realities. And when you step into an out-of-body state, you may be stepping into a different reality.
Oh, that makes sense.
It's not that dissimilar to some of you. You're probably old enough to remember, but there was a very popular writer, Carlos Castaneda, many years ago, and he talked about his experiences with Don Juan. There are a lot of people that have reported on things, and what I've learned is we've got to be very careful about taking our traditional way of understanding reality and thinking that it necessarily applies across the board. So we have other questions. I'll open up and let other people pose some questions if you like.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a little bit about, this is Sheila. I just wanted to say a little bit about levels of consciousness, and being an Akashic Records reader, I know that I go to different levels of consciousness. It has been written that the Akashic Records are on the 4th level of the astral plane. It also has been written that they are part of the cosmic consciousness. But I know that soul energy across lifetimes can be accessed through the Akashic Records. And I also know, whenever you're reading someone, that information that comes through, sometimes it's important because our lifetimes are linear. We measure our lifetimes by time. It's also important to know the sequence of events that are going to happen in someone's life so that you can relay that to them. So it's important for them to know past, present, and future. However, the information out there in the cosmic consciousness is not necessarily linear. It's all lifetimes, all soul passages. And also channeling, I've just come to know, as I've started channeling now, that information comes from the ascended masters, which is outside the realm of the cosmic consciousness. So there are about 8 different levels of consciousness, but the ascended masters are kind of a couple of rungs above the cosmic consciousness. So there are all kinds of levels of consciousness, and I'm always getting sort of wrapped up in where is this coming from? And bottom line is, I don't think it matters. The information's out there. If you can access it, that's really important to do that for someone if it helps them. So I try not to be so methodical or scientific about where is this coming from, and just go ahead and receive it and transfer the messages. But it's interesting. It's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think it seems to me the more knowledge we pick up, the more we realize how little we know.
Right.
And it's fascinating to run into people who've been having experiences, having people like Sean come talk to us and share his perspectives on things. It's just to me, it's a fascinating time to be here. Mark, you had some comments you'd like to make. Go ahead.
Okay, there we go. Well, I wanted to pick up on what Jim had said and what Charles had said about evidence. And I like something from Tom Campbell too. And I think the best evidence that I found using out-of-body experiences, he mentioned on pages 85 and 86 of his book, My Big Toe. And it was when he was helping Robert Monroe set up his laboratory, he and another engineer. And Robert Monroe let them both go out of body at the same time, and they went on the same trip. And Monroe recorded what they said or what they observed because they were able to speak while they were going through this. And he recorded them for an hour and a half. And then when they were finished, they came up to the control room and Monroe replayed the tapes. And they were within seconds of each other saying what they had seen, who they had met, what they had talked about. And Tom's comments were at the end, he said there was only one good explanation. This stuff was real. The undeniable fact was we had seen the same visuals, heard the same telepathic conversations, and experienced the same clarity. This stuff might actually be real, I said to no one in particular. I said those things, those same 6 words, this stuff might actually be real, over and over to myself 50 times during the next few days. I couldn't believe it, but I had to because I was there. And that's the best evidence from an OBE that I had found. And it's when you get 2 people go out at the same time. I had heard someone from a mystery school say that when they were teaching astral projection or guided meditations, that sometimes the teacher would hold hands with the student and they would go out on a guided meditation together. And then when they came back, they would go over what they had each seen. And then when they saw that they saw the same things, that would provide some evidence for the person who had done that. So I just thought I'd mention those just to, follow up on what Charles and what Jim had said.
Yeah, I'll mention one other book for those who are interested in evidence. There's a book called The Self Does Not Die. And it's a compilation of stories that medical personnel have submitted from their patients who mostly had near-death experiences that incorporated an out-of-body experience in that experience. And there was an element of that experience that tended to offer proof that this was a legitimate experience. For example, one woman who had a near-death experience in an ICU, left her body and went up through the ceiling into the room above. And the room was kind of dark, and she saw all these beds around the room with what appeared to be bodies hooked up to equipment. She then comes back into her body. She's been resuscitated, and she shares with the hospital personnel, or at least her doctor, what had happened to her. And he was just blown away because right above the ICU is a room that they use for CPR training. And they have all these mannequins around the room hooked up to machines. And he thought, how could she possibly have seen that? But that book, The Self Does Not Die, is filled with those kinds of evidential out-of-body experiences.
I also have a different form of, I don't know if I would call it evidence, but personal verification that came out of this exploration. And that was after I had spent a lot of time with the OBEs and lucid dreaming and opening up my mind that way. I started to have experiences with, I'll just go ahead and call them ETs, or non-human beings, where I would be in a halfway state, not sure if it was an OBE or a dream state or just in my body, but my mind opened up. But I had contact just a handful of instances of different kinds of contact with these non-human things, and they all look differently in different situations. And up to that point, I could not say for sure if it was something real, whatever the word real means anymore, but something real, or if I was just making it up. Was it a side effect of my imagination because of having so many OBEs? But then soon after those instances of having these encounters, in waking life, one afternoon, I went to the Botanic Gardens here in Denver, and there's a beautiful little hill. And I was wiped out from life. And I spent several hours laying down on the grass on the side of this hill. And my wife came and joined me. She called, "Where are you?" I went to Botanic Gardens, come get me. She came and laid down next to me on the hill. And then suddenly she goes, "What is that up there?" And she points and we look. And there's this little tiny orb, a beautiful turquoisey type color up and way high in the sky. And it wasn't moving. And then it would blink out. We kept looking and it would blink back in and then blink out again. And not on a schedule. It wasn't like on a clock or anything, but it was just in the same part of the sky. And first thing I did is I wanted to stand up and see who was around so I could say, "Hey, everyone, look." But there was no one around, strangely. And my wife wasn't willing to go there to say, "That's a UFO." But I thought, I think that's a UFO. And what's strange is for about a week after that, I felt a sense of grace coming over me. And which I attributed to seeing whatever that thing was in the sky. But still, not entirely 100% sure, even though I felt different. And then a few months later, I went away to Crestone for a weekend with a man named Ricardo Gonzalez from Peru, who's known for, since childhood, being in contact with these beings. And he would stand on his rooftop surrounded by family and in some cases, news reporters. And because he had been told psychically that the UFOs would appear at a certain day and time, and they came. And so he has years of this experience of communicating with them, and then they actually show up in broad daylight for people to see. But this is in South America, where I think they have a more mature approach toward UFOs than Americans do. It's just more open there. Where here, it's still kind of a joke for a lot of people, or the government's keeping it still secret. But down there, I think I get the feeling they're more open about it down there. But so he came to Crestone for a weekend event because he had been told that they would show up that weekend. So I went, and with a group of 50 people, 2 nights in a row, we saw things in the sky. And for me, that was an even better verification. It was better than what I saw in the Botanic Gardens. And it was better than what I saw in the liminal state while I was lying in bed and traveling to some other realm. But each one fed into the other, as if something knew that my ego or my consciousness, my personality couldn't take it all at once, but it had to get me there in baby steps. Here's something in the dream state. Here's something in the OBE state. Here's something that you'll see in broad daylight, but you won't be sure about it. And then here's something with a group of people who've been trained to call in UFOs. And I had that experience. The following year, I wanted to recreate the experience for myself. And I went to Moab, one of my favorite places on earth. And I rented a yurt to be there for 3 nights by myself and to do this process of calling down the UFOs. And I was up late one night and they didn't come. So I went to bed, and around 3 a.m, I was roused out of sleep, and I felt this need to go outside, and I did. And then they showed up. And I went back into the yurt afterward and fell back asleep and had a spontaneous out-of-body experience. But when I did, there was someone there with me, and he was kind of holding me on the ground, kind of covering me with his body. And the message was, you don't have enough energy for this right now. This is not a good time for you to be doing this. And then I returned to my body. But linking all those events together for me combined has a particular meaning and a message for me that assures me that there's something to this, even though I can't provide super strong evidence to someone standing on the street. But for me, the experience is transformative, and I'm a different person because of it, which I think is the most important thing. And that's the values. even though you couldn't prove that you were standing by your bookcase, Charles, when you were in college, I'm guessing it still changed who you are. It still added to your experience of being alive and being a person who could experience these things. And obviously you've carried the memory of it with you to this day.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's the most
you.
important thing.
You mentioned in South America, there's a different way of seeing things, at least as far as UFOs are concerned. I wonder, Sylvia is a professor in Mexico. I don't know if Sylvia, if you have any thoughts on a Mexican perspective about UFOs. Is it any different than what we see here?
Well, I always had an interest in UFOs. I think it is a gift from my grandmother. And I've heard that there were many, I don't know how to call them, but I haven't seen them yet. I've always looked for them. I always look for them up at night, but I haven't had the opportunity yet. And yes, I also wanted to pose a question to Sean. Sean, I thank you for your sharing and your experience. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, and I think it is very interesting because as teachers, we usually tend to tell the truth or what we perceive as truth to the student. And many of these things, we haven't experienced them yet. Like many of our textbooks, our own history, we don't have the experience. And I was wondering if you think this is like an educational problem. I think, like, for example, who has seen the number 0, for example? No one has seen the number 0, and yet we use it for building our house or for counting, for giving money to someone. And I was wondering if you think maybe this problem comes from, or what could you recommend us as human beings? Because I think that many of the things that we want to share, we don't have the experience yet. Like in many cases, our knowledge, as you have proposed, is very basic, and not only in terms of spirituality, but in other areas. And I was wondering, Sean, if you have something to say about that. Like, why won't we seek our own answers?
Yeah, that's a profound question. I think it's a very important question for the entire human race. How do we educate each other and help the next generation grow, at least maybe grow faster than us or in their understanding, so we don't have to recreate the same problems every generation? I think one important issue is people we create these rituals that produce effects. And it happens in religion, it happens in psychic stuff, that there's a ritual. You do a certain thing, or you say magic words, or there's a special book, or you move your hands a certain way. There's a ritual. And I think the ritual is a tool for the mind to work with its intention to produce the effect. But humans, for some reason, tend to confuse the ritual with the mind itself. And they fall in love with the ritual, and they start worshiping the ritual long after the ritual stopped working. So we just keep repeating these empty rituals without producing the effect anymore. But then because of fear, there's a lot of issues of control and ego and stuff there. So that's, if people can just know that the ritual is not the same thing as the actual experience, that will set people free to find new ways to have their own experience. Because if the ritual isn't working, they need to find a new ritual, or just try it without a ritual. So that's one thing. Also, luckily, because of our times, a lot of evidence for UFOs or other effects are available online or on video. Of course, it's getting harder and harder to tell which are false, like special effects, and which are true. So people have to be very smart about how to analyze that and not believe everything they see. Also, empowering people just by telling them You do not have to believe anything you see. You can look at it, but you do not have to accept it immediately or ever. And I think especially with the UFO community, this is getting more and more important because it's starting to resemble a religion. And different people are becoming the priests or the leaders where they know the answers, they know what's actually happening. And then they have their own group of followers, and like they're the source of the information. So people look to them instead of looking up at the sky. So empowering people to know that they do not have to believe anything, and they can keep looking, find their own way to experience these things, try different methods without committing to anything. Just keep trying over and over, have your own experience. I think most importantly, to remind people that just ordinary life and working with your heart and sharing with other people and taking care of the problems of this world are the most important things right now. I think with, do you remember earlier I was talking about people with psychic abilities? Some of them are nice people, but some still have egos and, the issues with narcissism and other psychological issues. So it doesn't really help that way. I hope that these things show people how interconnected we are, largely because I want people to realize how interconnected humans are with planet Earth. And we have so many problems right now in the physical world. Like the world is burning, it's polluted, it's getting too hot. We're not recycling. A very small number of people have a lot of money and many people are poor. And without food and education, the human race suffers more than for any other reason because of lack of food and education and safety. And I think that the highest levels of spiritual growth are possible for people who are not always afraid, who are not always hungry, who are not starving, who have all the basics taken care of. Then they can go pursue these other things. But I think, at least for me, I'm worried about planet Earth more than what's the next psychic thing I can do. And I think that's something anyone can pay attention to, whether or not they're spiritual, whether or not they're religious, whether or not they're having psychic experiences. They don't need any of that to realize that we are connected. We need to help each other and be able to share more and let go and make changes. But it won't happen if just one person becomes a saint. We all have to change our lifestyle to affect the rest of the planet. And we're running out of time. So
Well,
that's
there's
just
a related concept in your book that came to mind as you were talking. Backfire.
with the backfire effect.
Right.
Yeah, that's the other problem is if someone has a belief system that these abilities are not real, and then you show it to them, psychologically, human beings do what's called the backfire effect. They actually ignore the evidence and they believe even more strongly their original belief. And they do that in all aspects of life. You can't really convince someone. So in a way, even teaching them or talking about it doesn't do much unless they pursue it themselves and experience it for themselves. And in that way, the rituals and the books and things are helpful if they want to pursue it. But if they don't believe it, you cannot change their mind. They probably just need to have a near-death experience, which is completely spontaneous. And then they understand. And then they're like, oh, I was wrong. And now I'm right.
I have a question, Sean, that's kind of sort of pertaining to what you're just saying. And I've always wondered, the people that you were referring to early in your talk that have to have somebody to follow or have to have somebody to mimic or have to have something to look up to rather than going inside and figuring out who they are as a person. What do you think that is rooted in, that need? Where does that come from? Is that?
Well, I think it comes probably just from the way we're raised, that our parents are our authority figures. And as we grow up, we just look for someone else to replace that role of the parent. And we kind of grow up in a society that trains us to be disempowered.
Yes.
We're trained to give our power away to other people.
Yes, we are.
Even in the education system, the teacher is the authority. I mean, they know more, so and their job is to teach. They're good at teaching, so it's valuable. But after school, we're adults, yet we're still looking around for someone to tell us the answers. So I don't know. Maybe maybe there's a cultural opportunity there that between school and adulthood, some kind of ceremony or ritual or something that reminds people that they have the answers within themselves. The problem is governments and churches do not want you to have that point of view about your life.
Yeah, and it's occurred to me that perhaps on the soul's journey, if you look at it across generations and across time, maybe some of that is, some of that belief or that need to follow someone is embedded in the need for safety. I mean, it could be that, you feel safe when you're part of a community of people, or maybe, tribes that were very familiar with war in the past have moved toward following someone to feel safe. And, there are all sorts of societal pressures in that direction. But the good thing is, I think now people are realizing that you really do have to go inside and figure out who you are, as part of your growth, part of your personal growth.
There's this other aspect too, and it has to do with just being a human being. And there's a book by Malcolm Gladwell called Talking to Strangers. And it's an amazing, all his books are great, but this one is also very interesting. And it talks about humans are not very good at detecting lies. We're very naturally trustworthy. And the value to that is, as a group, we get along better. We do business with each other. We help each other in communities because we believe what the other person is saying. And that's why we're terrible lie detectors. And so when someone has no problem lying to us, we individually suffer. But overall, humans are trustworthy and they're willing to give their trust to someone else. And so I think that continues in the spiritual and the religious realm. We're willing to trust people who are offering us information. And for the most part, I think it's good for the planet. Even religions have certain principles that act as ethical codes or moral codes. And it's for the benefit to help people get along, So it's just part of our DNA to seek leadership and to find things that we have in common with other people. So we're not bad. It's just, it kind of works mostly, but sometimes it just doesn't work. And it definitely doesn't work with the wrong person who's trying to take advantage of you.
Right.
So back to Sylvia's original question, that's the other thing, is training people how to evaluate teachers, how to tell the difference between an authentic, honest teacher and how to analyze their teachings and how to tell them from someone who does not have your best interest in mind. Who's trying to get something from you that doesn't benefit you. How do you train people? So helping the young people know how to, and also how to vote, how to consider, look at candidates and look at their psychology and see if they're fit to take office,
Yeah.
So giving people a basic training in psychology and mental health and mental illness, how to tell the difference, is really important.
We've been at this for almost an hour and a half. Normally we try to bring things to a close, but I want, if there are anybody who has a question that hasn't had a chance to raise their hand, I just want to let people know we're going to close pretty soon, but if somebody wants to pose a question, please feel free to ask. Well, Sean, thank you very much for sharing things. I'll go back to the book, Renegade Mystic. Sean talked about a lot of things that are in that book. If you feel so inclined, it's a good read. I wish you well. When the next book comes out, let us know. Maybe we'll have you back to talk about that book.
Sounds good.
You will learn something new and something to share with us a year down the road.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Jim, for inviting me, and thanks to everyone here at Consciousness Cafe. You asked some great questions. It was great to chat with you, and
Mhm.
really appreciate all of you. So thank you so much.